I'm Lori Hutchison, Executive Director of the Lobular Breast Cancer Alliance, or simply LBCA. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this interview of LBCA's newest Scientific Advisory Board member, Dr. Rebecca Shatsky, who will be interviewed by LBCA Patient Advocate and founding member of the Alliance, Julia Levine. Before we begin, I want to share a little bit about Julia. Julia has been a metastatic lobular breast cancer patient for 11 years and an advocate for 8 years. She's the lead research advocate, publications/clinical trial curator, and serves on the Patient Advocate Advisory Board for the Lobular Breast Cancer Alliance. She is also a published co-author, grant reviewer, and a patient advocate on grant proposals. This interview is particularly meaningful for Julia because Dr. Shatsky is one of her medical oncologists, and they're also currently working together on a metastatic lobular project. So welcome, Rebecca and Julia. And Julia, I'm now going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Lori. Welcome, Rebecca. I'm so excited that you have joined the LBCA Scientific Advisory Board.
Thank you so much, Julia and Laurie. It's great to be here today and to take part in the organization.
Excellent. So why don't you introduce yourself briefly and tell us a little bit about your educational background and how you became interested in lobular breast cancer, both as a medical oncologist and a researcher.
Absolutely. So I am an academic breast medical oncologist. I did my undergraduate training at Cornell University in New York, did breast cancer research at Weill Cornell and Sloan Kettering for 2 years, and then went to University of Southern California for medical school and UCLA for residency. I did a breast-specific hemonc fellowship at University of California, San Diego, where I now reside as an attending physician and the team leader of the breast medical oncology program. But lobular breast cancer is something that I became interested in my fellowship when I started seeing patients with my mentor at the time who had metastatic lobular breast cancer. And I realized especially that this was so different from the way that ductal breast cancers presented, and that it was highly missed as far as the extent of disease being able to be evaluated on imaging, and the unique way that lobular breast cancer infiltrated tissues and metastasized. I started doing translational breast cancer during my fellowship, and I've written clinical trials for the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. I've also developed, in conjunction with the lab that I work with, some patient-derived xenograft models, including multiple lobular breast cancer models that we've been able to study sort of the uniqueness of this disease in a in vivo setting where we can test multiple drugs and look at the unique gene expression in these mouse models. And then, as you know, most recently, I've gotten involved in potentially writing clinical trials for lobular specific metastatic breast cancer in looking at better ways to image the disease and follow it for progression.
That's fantastic. So my next question was, do you have a specific specialty in your work as a medical oncologist? I think you basically answered that.
Well, yeah, and I'll add to that. So I definitely specialize in advanced disease. About 50% or more of my patients have stage 4 breast cancer. So in the early stage setting, I tend to focus on very high risk disease as well. Those that have either inoperable tumors or significant lymph node burden. But I also, in the curative setting, take on a lot of patients with lobular breast cancer that's likely under-imaged, I guess I would say, who have a potentially extensive lymph node burden that can't be accurately assessed, and that need neoadjuvant therapy. But in the metastatic setting, I focus really in a two-pronged approach of lobular breast cancer and also aggressive subtypes of triple negative breast cancer like metaplastic. So I guess I consider myself clinically a rare breast cancer tumor lady. But I don't call lobular rare. It's 15% of breast cancer.
Right. And there's a subset of triple negative lobular that
Absolutely. And so that's something that sort of unites those two as well. I have published, well, at least presented at San Antonio and I think ASCO in the past on triple negative lobular breast cancer, which is extremely underrepresented in the literature and the research community and a very difficult disease to treat. So that has been a particular interest as well. And then finally, I guess I forgot to mention, I work really closely with my neuro-oncology team here at UCSD because I do a lot of work in leptomeningeal disease and brain metastasis, which again, kind of unites those two research foci of triple negative breast cancer and lobular breast cancer.
right, both all understudied.
Yeah.
So, okay, so my next question was to tell us about your research related to lobular breast cancer and if and how your research has evolved your thinking about ILC.
It has, yeah. So one of the sort of backgrounds that I focused on in my training for oncology was cancer genomics and precision medicine. And so I'm very heavily rely in my practice and my research on multi-omics, meaning not just DNA mutations, but looking at RNA sequence data and protein expression and sort of in vivo immunotherapy measurements of response. And so I think that that has very much shaped my focus in looking at lobular breast cancer patients and my lobular breast cancer research because I have a particular interest in circulating tumor DNA and how treatment of lobular breast cancer is reflected in changes in circulating tumor DNA and the mutational burden, and seeing how that changes over time over which pathways are overexpressed in sort of driving tumor growth. Because lobular breast cancer tends to have specific overexpressed breast pathways of cell growth that we can follow, and those change with treatment over time. And so I find it to be a very useful tool in the monitoring of this disease for progression, because as we in the lobular community know, this is a disease that is not easily evaluable on imaging. And I don't just mean CT scans or PET CT, I mean all types of imaging. And so finding another marker that I can study these in has been helpful, and it's been an area of active research of mine.
Yes. And what do you feel is most needed in ILC research in general? And is there new on the horizon that you're excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that accurate ways to image the disease is probably the greatest unmet need in this disease, because both in the curative setting and in the advanced setting, it is really difficult to tell where this is. People can have livers, bone marrow, stomachs, intestine, all of this completely infiltrated with these cells and show nothing on scans. And I think it's just an absolute necessity that we find some kind of agent, whether that's a nuclear agent that can detect the cells or some kind of molecularly targeted therapy combined with imaging that can detect where the disease is, that we can have an understanding of the actual disease burden in our patients so that we can better direct and anticipate therapy changes and progression. So that would be my number one. I also think that kind of exploring targeted therapy options, potentially utilizing the mutation in the CDH1 gene that is sort of pathognomonic for this disease, is an area that we can absolutely explore, and synergy with other targeted agents, because targeted therapy does seem to be a great approach to treating lobular breast cancer. It's highly endocrine sensitive for at least the general majority of patients at first. But synergizing with other targeted therapies is a real key to keeping the disease at least at bay.
Right. And you and I have discussed how little literature there is on under areas that are hard to see on scan.
Image, yeah, we were discussing like specifically bone marrow infiltration happens in this disease, and there's such a paucity of literature on it if you look even on PubMed right now and in presentations at major oncology meetings. I mean, it presents as, random hydronephrosis, swelling of the kidneys on CT scan that people don't really realize what's going on. It presents as enlarged ovaries, like these sort of vague findings that if you go and biopsy, it'll be there, but it's very difficult to see on any type of imaging.
And some radiologists may not know how to look for it.
Exactly. So, when you're talking about this disease in community practice, especially without that sort of understanding that this could be the cancer, the CT scan findings can be read or as very vague and not suspicious, and it goes totally missed. If you have a radiologist that has a unique background and understanding of this specific disease, you're more likely to get scan findings that show, oh, this is not quite right. But, the education about the fact that this can be infiltrating in multiple tissues and not distort the architecture of the organ is super important, and that the disease can present this way because historically that's not the way that people think of breast cancer as presenting, because they think of ductal breast cancers and the solid tumors it forms in the liver or the lungs or the bones, but that's not the way that lobular generally metastasizes. It has to be a pretty overwhelming tumor burden to actually show a tumor ball, I would say, in my very non-medical terminology there.
Right. So there's a long way to go in that area. Actually, that is a good way to ask me about the next question, which was, can you tell us a little bit about what you do in ILC education and your work with community health clinics?
Yeah, so I love talking about ILC and educating the community oncologists. In my community, I do a large amount of CME talks for community oncologists, and I always make a point, even if it's not the highlight of the session, and we're just talking about new trial data, to highlight the nuances of how this affected or was a successful or not successful in lobular breast cancer with new data, and what proportion of patients in the trial, which is usually very small, had lobular breast cancer, and why that might be, highlighting to the community oncologists that this disease is underrepresented in clinical trials because of the difficulties of imaging, because it's not forming these tumors that we can watch shrink on RECIST criteria. And so I think that's a very, very important discussion to raise awareness amongst medical oncologists. As far as the patient community, it's sort of fallen into my lap that way because my patients are incredible. I have this really large population of patients with mostly advanced lobular breast cancer that have kind of come together on their own, and through what I found is like different ways, through like Facebook groups or other support groups, gotten the word out about me as a provider or physician that kind of enjoys taking care of patients with this disease and focuses on the nuances of it. But I still, in sessions and sort of patient sessions, I lead support groups and things like that for our metastatic patients. A huge proportion of them are lobular because our lobular breast cancer patients tend to understand that their disease is poorly understood and be their own patient advocates. So I've been very lucky in the advocacy world that, I can just sort of support my patients as they're acting as advocates.
That's great. And that brings me to my next question. We're both currently working on a metastatic lobular project together and a proposal for ASCO 2025, along with a few of our LBCA SAB members. How do you feel working with a patient advocate affects the project? And would you consider working with a patient advocate on your own future research projects?
Oh, 100%. I do not believe that there should be any cancer research without a patient who has the cancer involved. It is 100% essential because doctors and scientists have no idea what it is to live with a cancer, to have that cancer. And only the patient advocate truly understands that. And so their perspective is invaluable. And it should always be a partnership between patients who have lived with the disease, have experienced and understood what it is to have side effects from medication and what it is to have, the effects of the cancer on their body. um, I sort of was lucky in that I never really encountered in my early stages of my career otherwise, because I've been highly involved in the long-going I Spy 2 trial. And from day one of that trial's inception, we had very strong patient advocates. So that's always been a tenet of something that I believed was essential in clinical research and in translational research. So it's absolutely the one of the best parts of doing research is talking and understanding with from patients about their experiences and what they think is important about what we should be researching. It's also led to changes in my clinical care. I'm really inspired by and take very seriously the patient grassroots advocacy movement towards minimum effective dose of therapy instead of maximum tolerated dose. You know, I think it's horrific that we are advised to sort of give maximum tolerated dose immediately. And so in my clinical practice, that's generally something I strive not to do.
Yes, when possible.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you would like us to know about you, or anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah. So I would say that at my heart, I am very much a clinician. So I didn't start as a researcher. I never really envisioned myself as such. But what got me into research in general for breast cancer was just being disappointed in what therapies were available and the limitations of what I was having success in treating my patients and the limitations in imaging. And so that is what it kind of inspired me to get into research. But at my heart, my true passion is patient care and taking care of my patients and seeing how I can partner with them to control their disease and minimize side effects if at all possible, but also to make sure that they're getting the best care possible, because that's something that I see as a downfall of the oncology community, is that since this patient population and disease are so poorly understood, patients with lobular breast cancer, when they're treated by people that don't have a good understanding of the difficulties in this disease, the patients can get suboptimal care, and that there can be a huge difference of just by educating medical oncologists about the disease in how they approach their care in this. So that's sort of what led me here. And I'm hoping to make changes in the future so that we don't have to struggle with this, and patients don't have to be their own advocates in this disease as much as they currently do. Because as great a job as my patient community is doing with that, I feel terrible that they have to tell everybody all the time, like, actually, lobular breast cancer is different. You know, my liver enzymes might be going up because of cancer, and you just can't see it. My blood counts might be dropping because of my cancer, and I would love to take that off their plate by better knowledge of the disease in the community and better research and therapies and imaging.
Yes, and that's what LBCA is trying to do as well. So this will
Yeah,
be
and I'm really honored to be a part of this organization because it's something I've admired for a very long time.
great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really nice to talk to you.
Absolutely. As always, Julia, always a pleasure.
Thank you both for a very interesting conversation, and it's just, renewed my excitement about having you join us, Rebecca. We're really looking forward to working on developing the ILC educational session for ASCO 2025. And if you're already not part of our lobular breast cancer imaging curriculum development, I'll invite you to that as well, because it sounds like you have some great things to offer.
Yeah, I would love that. Very much looking forward to the ASCO session. This is long needed, and I'm glad that ASCO is finally kind of taking note at, educating the entire oncology community about this really important disease that represents a huge proportion of cancer patients, because 15% of breast cancer is a huge amount of patients.
Thank you also of joining and signing on to our campaign to raise awareness that October 15th is Global Lobular Breast Cancer Awareness Day.
Yes, I'm extremely excited about that, and I'm going to make sure that my institution has that well publicized, and hopefully special events in honor of that.
Wonderful.